Hi there, everyone. My name is Zach Burley. I'm going to be presenting for you today my work, The Dissapation of the Loco Foco Movement. I thank you for joining me here. I know that this is, of course, not how any of us wanted to have to do the symposium, but of course, we're always going to put the safety of all of us above any wantingness to be able to present this to you. Of course, I wish that I could, but I'm thankful to the library for sticking with the symposium and being willing to put this online, so this information that not just myself but all of us did and worked very hard on is still able to get to all of you and can be put on the record online and can stay there and can be a resource for future learners. So I'm thankful for the library for that. All right, so my work is about a 19th century American political movement known as the Loco Focos. You probably have not heard of them, but why it's interesting to you is because many people consider this group to be the historical predecessor to the modern-day Libertarian Party. Of course, there's a pretty large gap between the end of the Loco Focos and the beginning of the Libertarians in the 1970s, but many of the issues that the Loco Focos believed in and fought for have some similarities or ties to. They can be connected to the Libertarian Party. Both of these groups can. So that's why it's interesting even today. So I'm going to be telling you the story of the Loco Foco movement through the lives of two men who were closely associated, lived different lives personally and politically, kind of followed parallel, but are a good representation of a couple of different ways that Loco Focos would have maneuvered the political landscape of the 18th century. We have on the left John Bigelow, one of the most colorful characters in American history. He is just lovely to read. He wrote quite a lot, whether they be biographies or other works. He also has a just really great life that I think everyone should learn about. It's a lot of fun. And then on the right, we have Samuel J. Tilden, and if the name doesn't do it for you, he has a record to his name that is not very envious, and we will get to that later on. But with all that said, let's jump in. So the Loco Focos originate as the Equal Rights Party in New York City in the 1830s. Of course, Tammany Hall dominated politics in Manhattan at the time, as they did before and afterwards. The Loco Focos, the Equal Rights Party, were not the end of it by any means. But they saw injustice here. The issues that they believed in were not being represented by the candidates being put forth by Tammany. Of course, there was a conflict of interest. Specifically, the Equal Rights Party was concerned with monopolies. They were anti-monopoly. But we'll get more into their platform in just a second. I'll give you the backstory on how they get the name Loco Foco, because it's a rather odd name. Officially, they were referred to as the Equal Rights Party, but they get their nickname because they decided to stand up to Tammany Hall at a nominating convention. They go to this convention with a large crowd. They get in there early. They break into the convention, fill it up with their supporters, making noise. They have banners. They're just causing confusion throughout the convention to where business cannot be held. It's pretty clear that they're not going to be able to go through with this. And so the loyalists to the Tammany Hall institution decide to get out of Dodge. They sneak out the back door and they cut out the gas lights. And it's described by Fitzwilliam Birdsall, the scene is, in his official history of the Equal Rights Party. He says, quote, "It is 7:30, and darkness of midnight is in Tammany Hall. Nothing but the demon spirit of monopoly, in its war upon humanity, could have been wicked enough to involve such an excited throng in total darkness." End quote. Now, he's a little dramatic, but his work is great to read if you get a chance. Fitzwilliam Birdsall. He is describing the scene here. Now, they had a plan for this. They decided to get out of their pockets their Loco Foco self-igniting matches and candles. Now, before, matches worked much differently. These were able to, are like matches today, you would imagine, where you can just strike them up, and they were able to light up all the matches, light up all their candles, rather. Besides being a fire hazard, they were able to conduct business as normal, where they nominated their own slate of candidates, their own platform, and went into the city elections, the municipal elections, with their own candidates, and marked the beginning of their existence. Now, the Loco Foco name was not given to them by themselves. It was established really on them derogatorily by a couple of the newspapers in New York City that were sympathetic to Tammany Hall. So it's a name that they acquired and then passed on to the movement that would follow after them. because the Equal Rights Party exists solely in New York City in the 1830s, falls apart after a few years. The Loco Foco movement, while originating from here, is not really associated with it besides the ideas that they hold. The Loco Foco movement does begin in New York City. From a lot of people who were around during the time, probably knew about it, but were not directly associated with it. So now, as far as what these Loco Focos believe that spawned off of this is like the small story. The big story comes away from it. A group of people who have these ideas. Their platform is basically listed there at the bottom. Economic platform. They are anti-tariff, anti-internal improvement, and anti-central bank. It's described wonderfully by Ralph Waldo Emerson, of course, a writer who describes the Loco Focos in a pretty accurate manner. He describes them as stiff, heady, and rebellious. They are fanatics in freedom. They hate tolls, taxes, turnpikes, banks, hierarchies, governors, yea, almost all laws. And this is a very accurate representation. Of course, anti-tariff. Internal improvements were a big thing at the time with the Whigs and Henry Clay. They were decidedly against the canals and the roads that were being proposed to be built. They felt that this was not the role of government. The central bank as well, of course, infamously, Andrew Jackson had his duel to the death with the central bank and did win. Jacksonian democracy plays a large part in what the Loco Focos believe. It spawns from that movement. I would really say it's a sect within Jacksonian democracy. But they're more associated with his vice president, Martin Van Buren, who himself was from New York, and that's where the movement spawned. So a lot of them is associated around Jacksonian democracy, but more specifically Martin Van Buren. There's a whole list of things, also down to expansionism, which is the point right above that, the annexation and slavery spreading westward that comes from the Young America movement. So the two main contributors to Loco Focoism is, first of all, Jacksonian democracy, which is where many of these economic ideas come from. The other is the Young America movement and Manifest Destiny. There's plenty in the paper about this, and I don't have time to talk about it here, but I would encourage you to go and read some of what's written in there, some of the quotes. But Anthony Comegna, who writes the work that my work is based off of, The Dupes of Hope Forever, which literally wrote the book on Loco Focos. He talks about Young America and Manifest Destiny. Quote, "The most hopeful of Loco Foco-oriented young Americans argued for the territorial expansion of free, Republican government with its blessings, and Loco Foco Democratic publishers like John O'Sullivan embraced a romantic vision of America's manifest destiny to expand the reach of Republican institutions across the globe. These most hopeful of Loco Focos, those who retained an abiding faith in the morality and efficacy of democracy, believed so strongly that they supported violent efforts to extend Republican government, often arguing that long-term benefits would outweigh any immediate costs." End quote. So this Young American movement was prominent in Europe as well as in the United States. And of course, Manifest Destiny, we're destined to move all the way out to the West. A lot of subscribers of those beliefs within Loco Focos. These two groups, people that were both probably Jacksonians and both Young Americans, would have found a home in Loco Focoism. They, of course, are going to come along some conflicts later on with annexation and slavery, as Comegna mentions, that some of those central tenets are going to be conflicted with and are going to tear apart the movement when it comes time to reach a climax with the slavery issue. So now we're on to John Bigelow. I refer to his path as the renegade path because he's a bit more different than what Tilden does. So he is born in New York. He's a lawyer and an editor eventually at the New York Evening Post, which is headed up by William Leggett, who is the ideological head of the Loco Foco movement. His writings influence incredibly the projection and the future of the movement and many of its members, including John Bigelow. He goes to New York City to work in law and eventually meets up with Tilden and Leggett, where he goes and works for many years as the editor there. and writes quite a lot for the paper. He is, of course, influenced, as I mentioned, by Jacksonian democracy. A quote of his that reinforces this is, quote, "Too much government has a direct tendency to aid one man or one set of men in the pursuit of happiness and in the acquiring, possessing, and protecting property, if not at the expense of the rest, at least without rendering them the like assistance. As far as the conditions of animal existence goes, there is very little difference in the ability of all men to provide for themselves and families, and if it were all left without any special aid from government, both land and the products of industry would be far more equally distributed than they are. It is, however, the case that 4/5 of the action of all legislation is by law to promote the accumulation of prosperity in a few hands," end quote. Monopolies were another big target of the Loco Foco movement, and Bigelow is one of their monopolies' most outspoken critics. And this doesn't have to be in just the business world. This is also why they don't like banks, because those also fall under the category of monopolies, as well as later on we'll get to with slavery. So, of course, as Andrew Jackson goes out of power, Martin Van Buren comes in. You get legislation passed during this time that is very pro-Loco Foco, something that they would have really been happy to have, like the Independent Treasury Act of 1840. That's considered a victory for the Loco Focos as far as their ideology. As the time wanes on and Martin Van Buren is not reelected, he is defeated by William Henry Harrison. Got a little bit ahead of myself there. William Henry Harrison. These Jacksonians are just defeated, Bigelow and Tilden included. You don't get the guy that they had followed for so long in office, and they get the Whigs first through Harrison and then through John Tyler in office, and they break off eventually as the one of the paths of the Loco Foco party goes is firstly into the Free Soil Party. So they're originally part of the Democratic Party under Jackson and then Van Buren. With the expansion into the West, as we mentioned, of course, many of them were part of this Manifest Destiny movement. Whenever they get to the issue of Texas and war with Mexico, things begin to break up. The movement was typically located in the North, which is predominantly more non-sympathetic towards slavery, and many in the North, especially these Loco Focos, felt that acquiring Texas and possibly Mexico, even larger into Mexico, would open up slavery to the West, would break the balance of power in Congress. Many of the same issues that Northern Democrats were having with this, they also felt. So as this becomes more of an issue, a group break off of these Loco Focos from the Democratic Party and form the Free Soil Party, putting forth Martin Van Buren, who was both socially, economically, was their identifier forward as a presidential candidate. Now, of course, this doesn't go the way they want it to. He does reasonably well for a third-party candidate, does end up giving the election away. The Democrats do not win. I believe that was Zachary Taylor who wins as a result, and the Free Soil Party does get representation in Congress. I believe there's 13 seats that they get, and were able to at least secure something. So as the Free Soil Party disintegrates, one thing that Bigelow was growing more and more adamant towards was his abolitionism, or his rejection of slavery. His biographer, Margaret Clapp, writes, quote, once referring to William Cullen Bryant and John Bigelow, quote, once both of them had hoped to curb slavery through the new party while maintaining their democratic ideal of government. Bryant still clung to hope, but Bigelow, convinced now or never would the issue of slavery reach a happy termination, was willing to temporarily submerge all else, end quote. So as Bigelow becomes more abolitionist, he is not as willing for compromise and is looking for any opportunity to find this outlet for this. And of course, the Free Soil Party falls apart. It's no longer viable. And eventually you get the Republican Party in 1856 through John C. Fremont, of course, who runs as their nominee. And he becomes a founding member, as one of the founding members of the Republican Party very early on, and follows this path. So Loco Focos would have, those that would have been like him would have found a home in the Free Soil Party, but then as it fell apart, many of them would not have wanted to go back to the Democratic Party, would have felt that slavery was untenable, that there had to be a place for them to go, and they would have found a home in the Republican Party, as John Bigelow did. So the election of 1860 comes around, and Abraham Lincoln is elected president. There is a story that we'll get to with Tilden in just a moment on election night. But Bigelow writes afterwards, quote, "A more important bloodless revolution, it seems to us, has never been accomplished. For 4 more years of a pro-slavery administration would have been almost more than our Constitution could have withstood," end quote. So we go into the American Civil War. Now, Bigelow was a doubter that the South would actually secede. He did not believe that they were serious about this. He saw this as a huge victory for what he believed. And, of course, things do break apart, and we have the American Civil War. Bigelow stays involved during it. He serves as the American consul in France, in Paris. And I won't get into it, but there's great stories about him being heavily involved with keeping the Confederates from being recognized by France. He plays a very crucial role. I would encourage anyone to go out and read about that. The next issue of this, the next phase of this, is coming back from the war. We get into this second American state brought forth by historian William Hoffer. Very interesting. I'll read you a clip here from Anthony Comegna's writings, The Dupes of Hope Forever. Quote, "This second state was not a physical entity so much as a state of mind, a way that members of Congress began reconceptualizing the powers and limitations of government. Young American politicians, writers, activists, and voters joined pro-slavery Southern pragmatists and interventionist ex-Republicans in reinterpreting government's role in socio-economic progress. The trend towards support for an active, progressive state continued in the conservative wings of both parties well through the election of moderate ex-Whig Abraham Lincoln and his moderate Loco Foco Free Soil running mate, the former Democrat Hannibal Hamlin. The ensuing decades of Republican and Democratic sponsorship of land grant colleges, the creation of supervisory and bureaucratic oversight of agriculture, the Freedmen's Bureau, state standardization of education, and the bureaucratic regulation of commerce gradually entrenched the second state in ways never foreseen by Loco activists in the 1830s, 40s, and 50s. So when Bigelow comes back from France, he's in a much different America than the one he left. He realizes that the money that he had before would have been a fortune. The money that he has now would have been a fortune before the war. Now it was hardly enough to get by. The government was nothing like what it was before. It had grown immensely. And he switches over. He does not agree with the Republican Party anymore, with what it had become. He writes, quote, "The engrossing questions which succeeded the Civil War were financial ones. How to pay the debts contracted for the war with the least inconvenience to the taxpayer and the least prejudice to the public credit. Upon financial subjects there had always been the greatest diversity of opinions among the people who composed the Republican Party, the Free Soil Whigs, and the Free Soil Democrats. And the Democrats were always much sounder in their financial views, more economical, and had enjoyed, as I thought deservedly, a larger share of public confidence. There is now every reason to presume that the original democratical elements of the Republican Party will return to the Democratic Party, and the Whig elements of it, which united with the Democrats to oppose the extension of slavery, will look for their affinities among the Republicans, and that the Democratic Party will resume its natural ascendancy in the nation and maintain it." So he switches back to becoming a Democrat, rejoining Samuel J. Tilden, who we'll get more to about in a minute. But he says that quote, "that though there are not many men in the country who had more to do, humanly speaking, with the organization of the Republican Party than I had, I cannot say that I contemplate the prospect of its defeat with regret. The fact is, its raison d'etre has ceased." Excuse my French, end quote. he comes back to the Democratic Party because he sees that the Republican Party is not anymore serving the purpose that he had joined it for. It was to end slavery. They had ended slavery. That was over. He now saw that what he aligned with most was the Democratic Party. This would have been typical for Loco Focos of the time to have been involved, surely, for the reason of abolition, and were growing into a country that maybe they didn't recognize anymore with this idea of land-grant colleges and the growth of railroads and state-sponsored intervention into education. All of this would have been foreign to them, and they were looking for somewhere else, and that was not going to be in the Republican Party. They weren't going to find it there. So upon his re-entrance back into the Democratic Party, he meets back up with his old friend Samuel J. Tilden, who had remained a Democrat during this whole time. And his Bigelow's biographer, Margaret Clapp, writes, quote, "What bound them together was a common political philosophy shared for 35 years, which is Locofocoism. Belief in democracy, equality of opportunity, a government of laws that kept centralization to a minimum, and in economical, honest administration," end quote. So he was always connected through his political beliefs to Tilden, but was on the other side of the conflict from him during the Civil War as far as the parties go. So he eventually becomes an appointee by Tilden to head up some investigations into some canal rings, and then eventually becomes one of his quote-unquote campaign managers during the 1876 election. Now, of course, Tilden is not elected, and afterwards, Bigelow really gets out of politics. He helps some Grover Cleveland, who's also a fellow New Yorker, and he's a part of a different generation. That's the big thing that we're coming to. With the end of the Loco Foco movement, it ends because there are no more carrying it on. These people were influenced by the writings of William Leggett and Jacksonian democracy. Bigelow and Tilden were really the last of the last. Now, Bigelow lives on into the 20th century, but he is a part of a group that isn't continuing on. The next group is really, if you want to look at the next continuation, would be someone like Grover Cleveland, who is similar in many ways, but of a different era. The era after the Civil War is much different than the era that Bigelow and Tilden grew up in. So it's just different circumstances, so of course they're going to have different views. He does have some influence in that election, but it really doesn't take much more. This is the part where Loco Focos fade away. Many of them would have gone, like Bigelow, back into the Democratic Party post-war, and most likely would have stayed there following people, especially because they were confined to New York, like Grover Cleveland, but their existence really goes away after this. The 1880s, 1890s disappears as you get the growth, the incredible growth of monopolies, and during this time, really, in the high tariffs that you get under McKinley, I believe, just incredible tariffs and things that just would have appalled a Loco Foco of the 1830s and 40s, and it just disappears basically away. These terms, these uses of the word Loco Foco, it just gets away into non-existence, and it just ceased to exist. You don't really see another movement like this either until the Libertarians of the 1970s, when they found the party much later on. But you don't really see a group like this for a while that believe these sorts of things. You see small parts of it. But Bigelow's path is one of being a renegade, one that flows through things, that goes from this Democrat into a Free Soil Party member, into the Republican Party, and then back. And this would have been common for people of the Loco Foco Party. That's the thing, is that they never are a political entity on their own, but they're a demographic, a group that is incredibly influential in a state, in New York primarily. But there are others. Abram D. Smith is in Canada and Wisconsin. There are others across all states. Walt Whitman, who the poem at the beginning, one song, America Before I Go, he penned that. There are plenty all over the country, but it's primarily located in New York, and they are incredibly influential in the New York State, which is one of the most influential states. So if they can control politics in New York, they can control politics in Washington, and that's something they do. They are a demographic that shifts and moves, but are incredibly important and had to be won over on multiple occasions. So that's John Bigelow's path, the much more fluid one, and now we'll see Tilden's. So I titled Tilden's path the party man path because he is loyal isn't quite the right word, but we'll go with the word loyal to the Democratic Party. So he and Bigelow, very similar. They're both lawyers from outside the city of New York. They both come to New York to find work, and they both do in various not only law capacities, but both in writing as well for various newspapers. But Tilden is very much more associated with the Democratic Party than Bigelow is, and it's much more tied to it. But just to give a little bit of background on some of his beliefs, just to pass the check here of what he believes, he writes, quote, "The capitalist class has banded together all over the world and organized the modern dynasty of associated wealth, which maintains an unquestioned ascendancy over most of the privileged portions of our race, and which is now striving to extend its dominion over us," end quote. He continues on talking about the Panic of 1837, quote, he rallied against, quote, "monarchy and a privileged nobility who regulate our affairs," end quote, and, quote, "levy an indirect tax upon the unprivileged masses for the benefit of the few," end quote. So that sounds almost socialist if you listen to it. But remember, they are anti-monopoly, and they view that as basically the worst thing possible. So he's referring here really to the banks and talking about, specie circular and the monies at the time. But that's his background check on Loco Focoism. But he was much more willing to appease the Southerners over the issue of slavery. So now, throughout the history of the Democratic Party during this time, you have people like Franklin Pierce is a great example, a Northerner who also was associated with Loco Focoism, who was, of course he gets the name Doughface for appealing to the Southerners. And this is something that Tilden also does. He, unlike Bigelow, who was willing to put the abolition of slavery over the Union, or rather over a continuation of the Union, Tilden was not willing to do so. He always saw that the togetherness of the Union was more important than abolition. He writes about this saying, quote, "I am decidedly friendly to a protective system, though not a prohibitory one, and should regret seeing it abandoned," speaking about tariffs. "But if it can only be sustained by producing such deep and settled dissatisfaction as exists in the South, and which has enabled a few disappointed demagogues to bring us to the very verge of disunion, it must go. Mutual conciliation and compromise is preached from every quarter, but every man seems waiting for his neighbor to practice it. Let us then set the example. Let us meet our opponent on the middle ground, and if that is not sufficient, let us go farther. Let the protection system be made a peace offering on the altar of union. Let the protection of our manufacturers be reduced until it can fairly be considered as incidental, but let this be gradually done so as not to ruin the thousands who have engaged in them and whom the faith of the nation is virtually pledged. I am much more sanguine than you yourself expressed to be, and in the expectation that the present Congress will provide for a reduction of the tariff so as to satisfy all who are willing to be satisfied, and I hope, in doing, they will avoid these sudden changes which are the bane of our legislation." So, end quote. Obviously very passionate about the tariff, as he says he is in favor of a protective system, but not a prohibitory one, as many those in the North were. He is not willing to defend it over disunion. He says it must go. It's got to go if we can't find something here. So he does get into politics in New York. He gets in this big debate where he defends Silas Wright, who was running for governor. He gets some acclaim because of that, eventually is elected to public office, and gets involved in this mix-up that really defines the Loco Focos of New York at this time in the battle of the Hunkers versus the Barn Burners. Now, as expansionism was growing and the call for the annexation of Texas and the war with Mexico, perhaps, it was inevitable to follow. you have two sects forming in New York. You have the Hunkers, who are either promoting the expansion of slavery or are not opposed to it. And then you have the Barn Burners, who are led by Martin Van Buren and other various Loco Focos, including John Bigelow and Samuel Tilden. They are vehemently opposed to it and do not want to see the expansion of slavery by any means. So he does get involved with these factions and is a barn burner himself, is elected to a state office, and is also involved in the New York Constitutional Convention. He, just like Bigelow, is involved with the Free Soil Party. He does lead the Democratic Party long enough to become a part of this. He's drug along with it by Bigelow. He's asked to join. He sees the results and gets a much different view than Bigelow does. Bigelow sees this as, partly a success, that this can be done, that we should stick around with this, and Tilden sees it as an untenable position. They're sacrificing some of their other views because remember, this is a coalition. The Republican Party eventually will be a coalition of others, not just Loco Focos, as the barn burners are largely made up of. The Republicans are not at all. It's much more a mixture, and he doesn't see sacrificing those beliefs for something that's not going to work, and especially not a one-issue party. He does not see a party based on one issue as being able to coalesce, as the Free Soil Party did. He doesn't see it to be tenable, and so he does not join the Republican Party. He draws a much different conclusion, which Loco Focos of the time would have done. Whether they supported the Free Soil Party or not, they could see it as a failure and did not want to continue on with following it down the path that led towards republicanism. So eventually we get the election of 1860, and this is the story I wanted to tell you. William Cullen Bryant and John Bigelow are gathered on the night of the election in New York City, and Tilden has dropped by to watch, or not watch, to wait for the results to come in. And as the results do come in, it becomes more and more evident that Abraham Lincoln is going to win. The more and more the demeanor of Tilden changes, and he puts his hands in his head, and Bigelow asks him what's wrong, or he's asked to be checked on. They ask to check on Tilden, and he stands up and issues this comment rather angrily. He says, "I would not have the responsibility of William Cullen Bryant and John Bigelow for all the wealth in the sub-treasury. If you have your way, civil war will divide this country, and you will see blood running like water in the streets of this city." Now, he had been proclaiming that this was an inevitability. If they continued to push the South on slavery and were not willing to compromise, that this would happen. And this quote here, on the night of the election, before it even came in, is just forecasting what's about to be the next 5 years. And he eventually, he leaves, and eventually Bigelow will check on him and everything like that. But he starts this new path down his life and for many of the Loco Focos of constitutional opposition. And, the Democratic Party has a difficult time during the Civil War because you have people like Clement Vallandigham, who is greatly opposed to the war. They're Copperheads. That's not really what Tilden is. Tilden describes his constitutional opposition as such, quote, "I am quite aware how difficult is the conduct of a constitutional opposition during the period of war, how necessary it is to guard against the degenerating into faction, and to keep its measures directed to attaining the utmost practical good for the country at every varying stage of public affairs. I know also that such an opposition is often the only means of preserving civil liberties or of conducting an existing war to a successful termination. Often when honest, patriotic men, writhing under a sense of public danger, intensified by a future into which no eye can penetrate, have appealed to me to say what we would do to save the country, I have occasion to counsel patience with error, which were drifting us as well as their authors to swift destruction, to revive the sense that men who at present administer the government are our constitutional and legal agents, and that though they claim from us our full share of the burdens and sacrifices which their policy imposes, without the slightest difference to our convictions in respect of the public interest and public safety, we must still loyally accept disappointment and natural disaster if they should come, before the organism of the government can be reclaimed to a better policy in the due course of the elections. End quote. He defines this as basically being a watchdog during the war. He administers military strategy. It's in the paper. I would recommend you to go there. Don't have time to refer to it specifically, but he speaks with military officials on what they should do militarily, politically as well, advises members of the cabinet, because of course Lincoln puts together a group that aren't just strictly Republicans, so he's able to have some influence there as well. And this is would have been it's difficult for him to walk this line of loyalty, disloyalty. How do I support the country while also not supporting some of the things that are going on that I don't agree with? And that would have been difficult for Loco Focos of a time to do as well. Some of them would have been anti-war copperheads that would have gone out of their way to make sure they didn't support the war. I mean, you have the draft riots in New York, and it's certain that some of those were Loco Focos, some of them that were vastly opposed to what was going on. And then there would have been more that would have been like Tilden, who were not agreeing with Lincoln and his policies or his execution of the war, but still wanted to see the country come out on top and as a unified country. This will come back to haunt Tilden, though, later on. So the war is over, of course, and he continues his role in politics. Is eventually elected governor of New York, where he gets this aura of a reformer through his pursuing of the Tweed rings and the canal rings, breaking up these monopolies and these backroom deals that were going on, and with the help of Bigelow. And there's plenty about that. Very interesting there, but doesn't pertain to the Loco Focos as much. More as just a Tilden. But he gets this national prominence as a reformer. So going into the election of 1876, Grant thought about a third term, does not get a third term, and Tilden was a great detractor of Grant at the time. So he decides to run for is urged to run for president, because Republicans have dominated government since basically 1860. And a lot of people are dissatisfied with what's going on, Tilden included. He sees Reconstruction as basically a way for the Republicans to dominate government, to dictate how things are going to be, with basically no interference from the Democrats. He views Reconstruction and the Freedmen's Bureau. There is racism in what he says, but mostly what he is saying, some of what he's saying here is that he views them as well-intended, the Freedmen's Bureau, but that basically the Republicans are using all of the freed slaves to rule over the majority of the whites in the South who would not vote the way that they're voting. Basically saying that you get an extra couple of senators and some more congressmen, that you can pad your majority in Congress by giving the rights by giving the right to vote to these African Americans now, these people who are given the right to vote. And these things are merely propping up the Republican regime and continuing on these government growing policies. He's very negative views of Reconstruction. Like I said, perhaps he thinks that they're well intended, but in the end is just a way of retaining power for the Republicans, and doesn't see them as good for the nation overall, and of course with his views of Loco-Fogoism. So he goes into the election of 1876, and this is where we have The Fraud of the Century, which is a book that I reference, great book talking about, I mean, you think that things are divisive, or that, we talk about the elections in 2016 and in 2000 where the person who wins is not the person who wins the popular vote. Well, Tilden, the record that he has is he is the only person he's one of four, I believe, that are not elected but won the popular vote. But he is the only one of those who got more than 50% of the vote. So actually a majority of those who voted for Tilden, but he still did not win the actual election because it came down. He needed one electoral vote, one more, and there were 4 states in question. It was Oregon, Florida, Louisiana, and South Carolina. The results coming in from the South were going to be contested. The Republicans and Democrats were just rigging the elections there and made it difficult to get exact answers. So eventually you have this deal where the Republicans get the White House and the Democrats get the end of Reconstruction. Tilden does not get elected and dies in 1884, I believe, just a few years afterwards. But this ends his role in the government side of things. He does not. He thinks about running again, and he's urged to, but he decides not to beat Rutherford B. Hayes. But this brings an end to his side of the path, one that is strictly Democrat mostly. He does have his bit with the Free Soil Party, but he remains more committed to the Union and to the Loco Foco movement as staying with the Democratic Party, as he does throughout the difficult time to be a Democrat during the Civil War and during Reconstruction, and attempts to give them this high tide, this high watermark in 1876, and that would have been remarkable had someone so closely aligned with Loco Focoism been elected to that position. But that is a pretty good representation of the Loco Foco movement. It reached the tops of American politics, but never really got there. Martin Van Buren was very much a Loco Foco, or was influenced, or had many of the ideas of Loco Focoism, but really Tilden was a son of Leggett and a son of Jacksonian democracy. As well as the followers of Bigelow, the ones that followed the path of Tilden would have faced a very similar world afterwards, would likely have supported Grover Cleveland the next time around, but would have been faced with a much different world, and their positions became impossible to withstand and faded off into the footnotes of history to bring it to a close. So I hope this can illuminate these groups, this movement. They play a very important part in the national conversation, very similar to the way libertarians are today, in that they don't get anything done themselves on the national stage because they are never elected or aren't officially a part of the national stage as a party. But the beliefs that they hold influence the conversations going on in Congress, in the White House, in Washington, or even in their individual states. And they are able to get things that they believe in passed, or shift the platforms of parties towards their own beliefs through their own actions. They are very strong in New York during this time and play a crucial role in multiple electoral results, whether that be presidential, gubernatorial, or even all the way down to municipal. So they're very influential in American history and play a role that I think needs to be understood by everyone in order to really get a grasp on what we're facing today, as well as the history of our American political parties. So I'm happy to take any questions by email. You can email me at Zach, Z-A-C-H, at Burley, BERLY.org. I'm happy to answer anything about the presentation. The paper is continuing. It can go on forever. I mean, I'm past 50 pages now because this can continue on. There are so many more Loco Focos, and Fernando Wood, who was the mayor, the wartime mayor of New York City, infamous. Walt Whitman was one himself. There are just countless numbers of very famous American politicians and figures that could be wrote about. So right now it just contains Tilden and Bigelow, but it could be expanded further on. So please let me know if you have any questions. I'd be happy to answer them. I appreciate you listening to this. It's going to go over the amount of time, but it does not matter to me. This is about sharing knowledge, sharing with you what I've learned, and that I hope that you can learn something yourself. So I hope that has been done, and I would encourage you to read the paper that has been submitted. Like as I said, it is continued, and I will be submitting that as well for those who would like to read. And if you are interested now, I can send you the parts that I do have that run up through Samuel Tilden. So I thank you for watching, and I hope that you learned something. Reach out to me if you have any questions. Thank you.